You underestimated me, officer. Her voice cut through the silence like the crack of distant thunder. For a moment, even the ceiling fans seemed to hold their breath. No one in that courtroom knew what was coming. Not the officer who smirked behind his badge, not the prosecutor tightening his tie, and certainly not the spectators who thought they'd seen it all. What they didn't realize was that the woman they were judging wasn't a criminal. She was something far more dangerous. The morning light slanted through the courthouse windows, stretching across the polished wood floor like prison bars of gold. The air was heavy with tension, thick enough to taste. Rows of benches groaned under the weight of curious onlookers. Journalists scribbling notes, townsfolk whispering theories, and a few who had come simply to watch someone fall. At the defense table sat Ava Williams, her dark skin glowing faintly beneath the harsh artificial lights. Every inch of her posture screamed control. Straight back, steady hands, and eyes that absorbed every flicker of movement in the room. She wore a simple white blouse and black slacks, nothing flashy, yet her stillness radiated a quiet command that unsettled even those who didn't know why. Across the room, Officer Ethan Clark sat at the plaintiff's table, his police uniform crisp and polished. Confidence dripped from his smirk like oil on glass. To him, this was routine, another day, another defendant. He'd told his story, rehearsed it until it sounded like truth, and expected everyone to believe him. After all, who would dare question a decorated officer's word against a black woman's? State versus Ava Williams, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the high ceilings. The doors opened, and Judge Samuel Wright entered, his face lined with years of weary justice. The courtroom rose in unison, and as he took his seat, the tension deepened. The judge's gaze moved from Ethan to Ava, lingering briefly on her before lowering to his files. Something about her composure seemed to intrigue him, that calm defiance that doesn't come from arrogance, but from experience. "Officer Clark," Judge Wright said, motioning to the stand. "You may proceed." Ethan stood slowly, smoothing the front of his uniform, his every movement deliberate. He looked at Ava as if daring her to blink first. She didn't. "I was responding to a disturbance call," Ethan began, his voice loud, practiced, and laced with false concern. "I found the defendant loitering outside a closed business. When I asked what she was doing, she became hostile, refused to identify herself, and struck me when I attempted to de-escalate." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Pens stopped scratching. All eyes turned to Ava, a woman accused of assaulting a police officer. But Ava didn't flinch. Her expression remained still, her breathing steady. Only her eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Not fear, but calculation. "Thank you, officer," the judge said. "You may step down." Ava's lawyer, Jordan Davis, stood next. He was young, a little too green to hide the tremor in his voice. "Your Honor, before we proceed." "Save it for cross-examination," the judge interrupted. Jordan sat, deflated, but Ava leaned slightly toward him, her tone calm and commanding. "Stay focused, Jordan. Facts don't shake, people do." He nodded, steadied by her words. Ethan's smirk deepened as he returned to his seat. He gave a small wink to the officers in the back, a gesture of smug confidence that didn't go unnoticed. Ava watched, every motion of his body catalogued in silence. Her mind worked like a trained analyst, observing, remembering, waiting. When it was her turn to speak, the courtroom shifted. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, her face unreadable. Even the air seemed to pause as she took the stand. The prosecutor, Caleb Harris, approached with the sly confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. "Miss Williams," he began, "can you explain your actions on the night in question?" Ava leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but razor-sharp. "I can. But first, I need to clarify something. The officer's account isn't just inaccurate, it's intentionally misleading." A collective gasp swept through the room. The prosecutor raised a brow. "That's a bold accusation. Do you have proof to back it up?" Ava's eyes locked on his. "Not yet, but the truth has a way of finding its own light." Her words hung in the air, electric and heavy with implication. Even the judge shifted slightly in his chair. Something in her tone, measured, precise, unyielding, unsettled everyone listening. As she began recounting her version of events, the courtroom seemed to lean closer. Her voice was steady, her recall perfect. She remembered the flashlight in her face, the condescending tone, the unnecessary grip on her wrist. Every detail she described painted a picture of control, not hers, but his. And yet, as she spoke, something unspoken flickered behind her calm exterior. It wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about something deeper, something Ethan Clark had no idea he had awakened. A secret she carried quietly, one that would soon turn his entire world upside down. But before anyone could see the storm coming, the gavel struck. Court adjourned until tomorrow morning, Judge Wright announced. As the benches creaked and voices filled the room again, Ethan smirked at her one last time, a predator who thought his prey had been cornered. Ava met his gaze, unblinking, unbothered. Her lips barely moved as she whispered under her breath. You just picked the wrong woman to lie about. And when the truth comes tomorrow, it won't just save her name. It'll end his career. The night air outside the courthouse felt thick, almost metallic, the kind of silence that hums before a storm. Ava Williams stepped onto the courthouse steps, her posture straight, her face unreadable. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust toward her, but she ignored them all. Every reporter wanted a headline. She wanted justice. By morning, the entire town was buzzing. Local officer attacked by woman during arrest. The headlines twisted the truth, feeding the narrative Ethan Clark had so carefully built. But inside Ava's quiet apartment, she wasn't panicking. She was planning. Back in the courthouse, the following day carried a heavier energy. The wooden doors groaned open, letting in a flood of murmurs and tension. Ava entered first, her crisp navy blazer contrasting the neutral tones of the courtroom. Her steps were calm, too calm for someone accused of crime. Even the prosecutor noticed it. Caleb Harris leaned toward Officer Ethan Clark, whispering, "She's playing a game. Keep your story tight." Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched, his uniform flawless. But beneath the polished surface, his nerves were starting to betray him. Ava's composure unsettled him. Her eyes never wavered, her movements precise, deliberate. She didn't look like someone fighting to survive. She looked like someone preparing to strike. Court is now in session, Judge Wright declared, his gavel cracking through the whispers. The prosecutor rose, his tone slick and confident. "Your Honor, we call the defendant, Ms. Williams, to the stand." Ava stood and made her way forward, her head held high. As she took her seat, she glanced briefly at Ethan, not with anger, but with quiet pity, the kind that unnerves even the guilty. Caleb approached her with a thin smile. "Miss Williams, could you tell us what happened that evening?" She leaned toward the microphone, her voice level but commanding. "I was walking home from a friend's house. I stopped to check directions on my phone when Officer Clark approached me. He asked what I was doing there, but his tone wasn't professional. It was accusatory." Caleb's eyebrow arched. "And how did you respond?" "I asked him if I had done something wrong." "So, you questioned his authority?" he pressed. "No," Ava said, her tone tightening just enough to make the word cut. "I questioned his motive." The gallery murmured, but she continued before the judge could intervene. "I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't obstructing anything. But he grabbed my arm, without cause, and told me women like me needed to learn how to listen." A collective gasp broke through the crowd. Even the judge froze, the gavel hovering midair. Caleb blinked, caught off guard. "You're claiming that Officer Clark made such a statement?" "I'm not claiming it," she said. "I'm remembering it." Her words struck with precision, the kind that can't be rehearsed, because they come from truth. Ethan's smugness faltered. His shoulders stiffened, his breathing shallow. Caleb tried to regain footing. "Miss Williams, that's a serious accusation. Do you have proof of this alleged misconduct?" Ava turned her gaze toward Ethan, locking eyes with him for the first time that morning. "No, because his body camera malfunctioned." Conveniently, the silence was thick enough to drown in. Ethan shifted in his seat, his hand gripping the edge of the table. The jury noticed. Everyone noticed. Caleb cleared his throat. Let's focus on the facts, Miss Williams. What happened next? He accused me of resisting arrest, Ava said evenly, even though I never moved. When I asked him to let go of my arm, he slammed me against his patrol car. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It stayed calm, dangerously calm, like someone used to high-pressure situations. The judge glanced over his glasses. Did you resist in any way, Miss Williams? I resisted unlawful restraint, she replied. That's not defiance. That's self-respect. The entire courtroom hung on her words. Even Jordan, her young lawyer, felt a chill. He had underestimated the power of her poise until now. Caleb tried to redirect. Miss Williams, are you saying Officer Clark fabricated his report entirely? Ava smiled faintly. I'm saying the truth doesn't need permission to exist. You'll see soon enough. That line, confident, cryptic, and cold, sent a ripple through the courtroom. Judge Wright studied her in silence. He'd seen liars and martyrs, but Ava didn't fit either mold. The prosecutor, unsettled, finally turned back to his desk. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Wright nodded slowly. Very well. The court will recess until tomorrow morning. The gavel struck. As everyone rose, Ethan's gaze met Ava's again. But this time, the balance of power had shifted ever so slightly. She walked past him without breaking eye contact, her voice barely a whisper as she passed his shoulder. You think I'm scared of courtrooms, Officer Clark? I've faced worse. He turned his head sharply, but she was already gone, her footsteps fading down the marble hall. Outside, the sky was bruised purple, the air electric. Tomorrow would bring more than testimony. Tomorrow would bring the first crack in his story. And cracks, Ava knew, always lead to collapse. The night was quiet, too quiet for what it carried. A faint breeze whispered through the oak trees that guarded Ava Williams' small house on the outskirts of town. Inside, the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the silence. Ava sat alone on her couch, a cup of untouched tea cooling in her hands. The courtroom replayed in her mind. Every smirk, every lie, every eye that doubted her. But she didn't feel defeated. She felt focused. She had faced storms before, but this one wasn't fought with bullets or blades. This battle was fought with restraint, timing, and truth. And if there was one thing she'd learned in her years of service, it was patience. Justice, like warfare, required discipline. A knock at the door drew her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Jordan Davis, her young attorney, stood nervously in the porch light, clutching his briefcase like it held the answers to life itself. His tie was loose, his eyes restless. He wasn't built for silence. He needed words, explanations, certainty. Ava, he said, his voice low but urgent. We need to talk. She stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. Then come in, Jordan. You look like a man carrying ghosts. He hesitated at her door before walking in. The living room was minimal, but every object seemed placed with precision. A bookshelf lined with history and military strategy, a folded flag encased in glass, a single-framed photograph of Ava in uniform, smiling beside another soldier. You live alone? Jordan asked quietly. For now, she replied. Sit. He sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, his briefcase resting on his knees. Ava, I need to know what you're hiding. The judge knows it. The prosecutor knows it. And Clark, he knows something's off. I can see it in his face. Whatever card you're keeping close, I can't defend you without it. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes steady, almost unreadable. Then, with a quiet sigh, she stood and walked to the bookshelf. Her fingers traced the spine before pulling out a worn, leather-bound folder. The edges were frayed from years of use. Everything you need to know, she said, placing on the coffee table. My service record. Jordan froze. Your service record? Read it, she said softly. He opened the folder, his hands trembling slightly as he scanned the contents. His eyes widened with every line. Commendations, citations, missions that never made the news. His voice faltered when he reached the final page. You were a Navy SEAL. Lieutenant Commander, Ava corrected, leaning back in her chair. Retired, He stared at her, disbelief mixing with admiration. This changes everything. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted to see how they'd treat me without a title, she said. How fast they believe a lie when told by the right person in uniform. Jordan shook his head slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. You could have ended the trial in one sentence. And learned nothing in the process, she countered. This isn't just about me, Jordan. It's about a system that assumes guilt when the face doesn't fit their comfort. She stood and crossed to the mantel, picking up the folded flag and running her fingers along its edges. I've faced men who wanted to end my life because of the country I served, but I never thought I'd face one trying to destroy me because of the color of my skin. Jordan looked down, guilt flooding his expression. Ava, you're planning something tomorrow, aren't you? She turned, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. Tomorrow, I stop defending myself and start defending the truth. Jordan's brow furrowed. You think Clark knows who you are? Not yet, she said. But he's guessing. I saw it in his eyes today, the doubt, the fear. He's starting to wonder what kind of woman looks at him like that and doesn't blink. She returned to the table, her tone steady, controlled. Tomorrow, we don't just expose a liar, Jordan. We expose the system that made him believe he could get away with it. He swallowed, the realization dawning on him that the woman sitting before him wasn't a victim. She was a strategist, preparing for her next mission. What's the plan? He asked finally. Ava looked toward the window with a moonlight spilled across her table, illuminating the folder between them. Tomorrow, we show them who I really am, but not all at once. We let the truth build, layer by layer, until it's too heavy for anyone to deny. Jordan nodded slowly. You're not scared at all, are you? Ava set the folder aside, her eyes meeting his with a quiet ferocity. Fear's a luxury I left behind a long time ago. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the porch swing as if echoing the storm that was coming. Jordan rose to leave, but paused at the door. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said softly, I'm honored to stand beside you. She smiled faintly. Then stand tall, Jordan. Tomorrow, we don't fight for me. We fight for everyone who never got their day in court. He nodded, then stepped into the night, his footsteps fading into the darkness. Ava stood at the window, her reflection caught against the glass. A soldier once again, not in uniform, but in purpose. Her voice was a whisper, almost a promise to herself. Tomorrow, justice reports for duty. And for Officer Ethan Clark, it'll be the day his lies stop marching. The courthouse rose against the gray dawn like a fortress. Reporters huddled outside, microphones ready, cameras flashing. The story had spread overnight. Whispers of video evidence, secret witnesses, and a trial that could ignite the town. For most, it was just another headline. But for Ava Williams, this was war. And she had already chosen her battlefield. She arrived at the courthouse before anyone else, dressed in a navy blue blazer and crisp white shirt. Her steps were measured, her face calm, but her eyes held the kind of focus only soldiers carried into combat. Inside, Jordan Davis was pacing near the defense table, muttering lines under his breath. He looked up when Ava entered. You ready for this? He asked, voice low. I've been ready for years, she said simply, setting her bag on the table. When Judge Samuel Wright entered, the chatter in the courtroom died instantly. Court is now in session, he said, his voice steady but weary. State versus Ava Williams, Day 3 of proceedings. The prosecutor, Caleb Harris, rose first, his tone smooth but tight. Your Honor, the state intends to reinforce Officer Clark's testimony today and introduce further evidence supporting the charge. Ava's gaze slid toward Officer Ethan Clark, who sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture rigid, his eyes avoiding hers. The confidence that once radiated from him now seemed strained, a thin veneer cracking at the edges. Caleb nodded toward him. Officer Clark, please take the stand. Ethan rose, adjusting his tie, but the swagger that once accompanied his movements was gone. The murmurs in the gallery swelled. Every eye followed him as he swore in and took his seat. Officer Clark, Caleb began, please remind the court of the events that led to the defendant's arrest. Ethan's throat tightened before he spoke. I encountered the defendant outside a closed business. She was acting suspiciously, refused to identify herself, and became physically aggressive when I attempted to question her. And you stand by that statement? I do. The prosecutor smiled slightly, glancing toward the jury. No further questions. Jordan stood slowly. His voice was calm, but his presence seemed to shift the energy in the room. Officer Clark, he began, pacing deliberately, you testified that my client became aggressive and attempted to reach for your weapon, correct? That's correct, Ethan said. And yet, Jordan continued, you also testified that your body camera malfunctioned during the incident. Convenient, wouldn't you say? A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Ethan stiffened. Equipment fails sometimes. It happens. Of course, Jordan said, feigning agreement. But you've been on the force for what, 10 years? How often has your camera malfunctioned during an arrest? Ethan hesitated. Not often. Not often, Jordan repeated softly, letting the silence do the work. But it did this time, during an arrest where you claim you feared for your safety. Yes, Ethan snapped. Jordan turned, facing the jury. A coincidence, I'm sure. Then he paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Tell me, Officer Clark, would it also be a coincidence that a bystander happened to record part of that same incident on their phone? The courtroom exploded in whispers. The air shifted instantly. Anticipation, disbelief, tension. Even Judge Wright straightened in his chair. Ethan's eyes widened. That's not possible. Your Honor, Jordan interrupted, holding up a USB drive. The defense submits video evidence recorded by a witness on the night of the arrest. Caleb shot to his feet. Objection. This is highly irregular. Sit down. Judge Wright ordered sharply. We'll view the footage. The bailiff inserted the drive. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen flickered to life. The video was shaky, recorded through the window of a nearby car. But the audio was clear, painfully clear. Ethan's voice filled the room, harsh and commanding. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Ava's voice followed, calm, controlled. I'm not resisting. Let go of my arm. Then the image caught it. Ethan shoving her against his patrol car, his voice low but unmistakable. Women like you don't get to question me. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a shout or two. Judge Wright's gavel slammed repeatedly. Order. I will have order. But the damage was done. Ethan sat frozen, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. Caleb's jaw clenched as he rubbed his temple, realizing the case was unraveling faster than he could contain it. As the lights returned, Jordan turned toward the jury, his tone even but sharp as glass. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just seen contradicts nearly every word of Officer Clark's testimony. The truth, it seems, was never malfunctioning. Only his integrity was. Ethan stood abruptly. That footage doesn't show everything. Jordan didn't even look at him. It shows enough. The judge called for recess, and the crowd erupted into a frenzy. Reporters surged toward the exits, desperate to relay what they'd seen. The story had transformed, from accusation to revelation. As the courtroom cleared, Jordan turned to Ava, his face flushed with adrenaline. That footage just tore his testimony apart, he whispered. Ava folded her hands calmly on the table. It's a start, but walls don't fall from cracks alone. We need to bring the whole structure down. Jordan nodded. Then what's next? She rose slowly, her voice low and certain. Tomorrow, we don't defend, we reveal. Jordan frowned. Reveal what? Ava's lips curved into the faintest smile. Who I really am. Outside, thunder rumbled across the sky. It wasn't rain. Not yet. It was a warning, the sound of something breaking loose. And by tomorrow, the world would know the truth that Officer Clark tried so hard to bury. The next morning, the courthouse felt different. Not just tense, electric. People packed the hallways long before the doors opened. Reporters whispering, cameras waiting to catch the fall of a man and the rise of a mystery woman. The video had gone viral overnight, and the world now wanted to know who Ava Williams really was. Inside, the air buzzed like a live wire. Even Judge Samuel Wright, usually unshaken, rubbed his temples before calling the court to order. "Proceed, Mr. Davis," he said, his voice lower than usual. Jordan stood. "Your Honor, the defense would like to recall the defendant, Ms. Williams, to the stand." All eyes turned to Ava. She rose with quiet authority, her navy blazer sharp, her expression unreadable. Her walk to the stand was steady, deliberate, the kind of walk that belonged to someone used to command. When she sat, a silence swept the room. Even Officer Ethan Clark couldn't hide the tremor in his hand as he gripped his pen. Jordan stepped forward. "Ms. Williams, you've heard the accusations against you. Resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, attempting to seize a weapon. Are any of these true?" "No," Ava said simply. Her voice carried across the room, even unshaken. "Then tell us," Jordan said, pacing before the jury, "what really happened that night." Ava drew a breath, her eyes never leaving the jurors. "I was heading home after visiting a friend. I stopped to check my phone for directions when Officer Clark approached me. He demanded to know what I was doing there. When I asked why, he accused me of being uncooperative. Before I could answer again, he grabbed my arm and refused to let go." Her tone was calm, but beneath the words lay something magnetic, conviction. Jordan leaned in. "Did you threaten him? Raise your voice. Attempt to reach for his weapon." "No," she said, her voice firm. "I told him to release me. When I pulled my arm back, he slammed me against his patrol car and called it resistance." The crowd murmured. The judge's gavel cracked once, but not hard enough to erase the sound of growing outrage. Jordan's voice rose. "Ms. Williams, there's been speculation about your background, about who you are. The prosecution has painted you as an ordinary woman who suddenly turned violent. Is there more to your story that this court should know?" Ava paused. The air felt thick enough to hold. Then she spoke. "Yes," she said quietly. "There is more." Caleb, the prosecutor, shifted in his seat. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Ava looked at the jury, her eyes steady, her tone clear. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Ava Williams, United States Navy SEAL, retired." The courtroom gasped. For a full heartbeat, no one moved. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. "I served my country for 20 years, she continued, her voice steady but fierce. "I've led operations in combat zones across the world. I faced enemies who didn't believe I'd make it home alive. And I did it all to protect the same freedoms that Officer Clark tried to take from me that night." Judge Wright blinked in astonishment. Even he couldn't hide his respect. Ethan's face drained of color. His hand slipped off the table as he whispered to himself, "Navy SEAL." Jordan's voice was calm but cutting. "Ms. Williams, as a Navy SEAL, you're trained to stay calm under pressure, correct?" "Yes." "And during this encounter, did you use that training?" "I did," she said. "I used it to stay calm, to de-escalate, and to protect myself without violence. Because that's what real discipline looks like." Jordan turned toward the jury, his voice rising with quiet fire. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard lies, you've seen footage, and now you've met the woman those lies were aimed to destroy. A veteran, a protector, a woman who gave everything for this country, only to be treated as a threat in her own neighborhood." The murmurs grew louder. Anger, disbelief, shame. The judge banged his gavel again, but his voice faltered. "Order. I will have order." As the noise settled, Ava turned to Ethan. Their eyes met for the first time since the reveal. Hers were steady, his desperate. "Officer Clark," she said softly, "you saw a woman you thought was powerless. You mistook composure for weakness. But I learned a long time ago, calm isn't submission. It's control." Her words hit him harder than any strike could. The courtroom was silent, not out of obedience, but awe. Even Caleb Harris sat speechless, the words he'd prepared now meaningless. He closed his briefcase slowly, avoiding Ava's gaze. Judge Wright cleared his throat, struggling to reclaim authority. "We'll take a short recess," he said finally, voice quieter than before. "Court will reconvene in 20 minutes. As the crowd erupted in whispers, Ava stepped down from the stand. Her steps were unhurried, her expression resolute. She passed Ethan without looking directly at him, but her words floated just loud enough for him to hear. "You built your story on lies," she said, "but I built my life on truth. Let's see which one stands longer. Ethan didn't move. Couldn't move. The man who once smirked in triumph now sat hollow, staring at the cracks in his own armor. Outside, the courthouse steps were a swarm of reporters, cameras flashing, microphones colliding. But as Ava exited, she didn't flinch. She didn't smile for the cameras or wave for the crowd. She just looked up at the morning sky, calm, unbothered, untouchable. Tomorrow, the truth wouldn't just free her. It would bury him. By the time the courtroom filled again, the whispers had grown into waves. Everyone had seen the video, heard the confession, and now knew the truth. The woman sitting at the defense table was no ordinary defendant. She was Lieutenant Commander Ava Williams, a Navy SEAL who had spent 2 decades defending the very justice system that nearly turned its back on her. But while the crowd looked at her with newfound awe, Officer Ethan Clark sat like a man awaiting his own sentencing. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled his papers, trying to cling to the last fragments of his authority. The judge entered, the gavel fell, and silence reigned once more. "Officer Clark," Judge Wright said, his tone firm, "the court will allow the prosecution to recall you to the stand." "Proceed." Caleb Harris, the prosecutor, stood, his confidence shaken. He turned toward Ethan with a look that said we're cornered, but try to hold the line. "Officer Clark," Caleb began, "you've heard the defendant's testimony. Do you have anything to say in response?" Ethan straightened his shoulders, forcing composure. "Yes, Your Honor." The defendant exaggerated her story. "I acted within protocol. The video didn't capture everything that happened." Caleb nodded weakly. "And what exactly did it miss?" Ethan's jaw flexed. She was defiant. She questioned my authority in a public space. I had to take control of the situation. Jordan Davis rose immediately. "Control or dominance, officer?" "Objection," Caleb snapped. "Overruled," the judge said quietly. "Answer the question." Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting toward the jury. "Control," he muttered finally. Jordan stepped closer, his tone low but unrelenting. "So control means grabbing an unarmed woman, forcing her against a patrol car, and silencing her for asking why." Ethan's lips parted, but no words came out. Jordan continued, circling him slowly. "You said she reached for your weapon, correct?" "Yes," Ethan said, but the word trembled. Jordan turned to the jury. "And yet no fingerprints were found on your holster. No witnesses to corroborate your claim. Nothing but your word." Ethan clenched his fists. "I know what I saw." Jordan's voice dropped to a razor's edge. "Then maybe what you saw was what you wanted to see, a woman who didn't bow to your authority." The courtroom murmured again. Ethan's face flushed red. "Tell me, officer," Jordan pressed, "does it embarrass you that the person you tried to intimidate has faced enemies far more dangerous than you, and survived?" Ethan shot up from his seat, his voice cracking. "She wasn't acting like a Navy SEAL that night." Jordan didn't flinch. "And you weren't acting like a police officer." The words hit like a thunderclap. Ethan froze, realizing the echo of his own arrogance. Jordan took a breath, lowering his tone. "You didn't arrest her because she was a threat, officer. You arrested her because she made you feel small." Caleb tried to object again, but the judge didn't even look at him. The air in the room was thick, everyone leaning forward, watching Ethan unravel piece by piece. Ethan's voice faltered. "That's not true." Jordan's eyes locked onto him. "Then look at her," he said, motioning toward Ava. "Look at the woman you try to break. Does she look like someone who needed to fight you to win?" Ethan turned his head, his eyes meeting Ava's, and for the first time, he couldn't hold her gaze. She didn't glare. She didn't smirk. She just looked at him with calm, unshaken pity. The kind that doesn't need revenge because truth has already done the work. Jordan turned back to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Officer Clark, you may step down." Ethan did, but he didn't walk so much as stumble. His once pristine uniform now felt like a costume that no longer fit. His fellow officers in the back row exchanged uneasy glances. The silence that followed him wasn't supportive. It was damning. When he sat, Ava whispered just loud enough for Jordan to hear, "The wall's crumbling." Jordan nodded faintly. "Then let's finish the job." The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Davis, do you have additional evidence? Yes, Your Honor, Jordan said, retrieving a file from his briefcase. The defense would like to submit Officer Clark's personnel record into evidence. Caleb immediately stood. Objection. That's irrelevant. Overruled, Judge Wright said. Proceed. Jordan handed copies to the jury and approached the front. Over his 10 years on the force, Officer Clark has faced multiple complaints: excessive force, racial bias, improper conduct. All quietly dismissed. All forgotten. Until today. The crowd reacted in a low wave of disbelief. Ethan's face turned pale. His lawyer buried his face in his hands. Jordan continued, his voice firm. This isn't an isolated mistake. It's a pattern that ends here. He turned toward Ava, then to the jury. You've seen what happens when power goes unchecked, when authority forgets accountability. But you've also seen what strength really looks like, not in a badge, but in integrity. The judge's gavel struck once to quiet the murmurs, but even he looked changed, as if something within him had shifted. The prosecutor sat in silence, defeated. His case had collapsed, and he knew it. As the jury examined the documents, Ava looked at Ethan one last time. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the floor. The man who once believed himself untouchable now sat in the ruins of his own deception. And for the first time, the courtroom felt lighter, as if the truth had finally found space to breathe. But Ava knew it wasn't over yet. One more truth remained, and it would decide everything. The courthouse was silent as the jury filed back in. Every seat in the gallery was filled, every breath held tight. Reporters, townsfolk, and even officers who once stood by Ethan Clark waited in anticipation. The air was so still that when the door closed behind the jurors, the soft click echoed like a gunshot. Ava Williams sat tall at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't restless. She was resolute. Across from her, Ethan Clark stared down at the polished wood, his reflection fractured by the light. The uniform he once wore like armor now looked like a costume draped over guilt. Judge Samuel Wright cleared his throat, the weight of the moment pressing into his voice. Has the jury reached a verdict? A middle-aged woman, the jury foreperson, stood. We have, Your Honor. Please read it aloud. The courtroom felt as though time had stopped. In the case of State versus Ava Williams, she began, her voice trembling slightly, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges. The silence that followed broke like glass. Gasps, whispers, a muffled sob of relief from the gallery. The gavel struck once for order, but even Judge Wright's tone carried a note of reverence when he spoke again. This court acknowledges the verdict, he said solemnly. Ms. Williams, you are free to go. Ava exhaled slowly, her composure steady, but her eyes glistened for the first time. Jordan Davis, standing beside her, let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. You did it, he whispered. No, she replied softly. We did. But before she could rise, the foreperson continued. Additionally, the jury strongly recommends that an investigation into Officer Clark's conduct be opened immediately. The judge nodded gravely. So ordered. He turned his gaze toward Ethan. Officer Clark, I suggest you retain counsel. This matter is far from over. Ethan's head dropped lower, the weight of accountability finally pressing down. His arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like fear. Outside the courthouse, the steps overflowed with people. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But when Ava emerged, the noise faded into background static. She stood at the top of the stairs, the morning light falling across her face, her presence commanding. This isn't just my victory, she began, her voice carrying through the crowd without need for a microphone. This is a victory for truth, for accountability, and for everyone who has ever been silenced by power. She paused, scanning the faces before her, strangers, neighbors, officers, journalists, all listening. I didn't fight this battle alone. I fought it for every person who's ever been told their story doesn't matter. Because it does. And today proved that no lie lasts forever. The crowd erupted in applause, a thunderous sound of vindication and respect. Jordan stood beside her, pride in his eyes, his briefcase forgotten at his feet. Later that week, the headlines would tell the story. Former Navy SEAL cleared of charges. Officer suspended amid scandal. Truth in uniform. Ava Williams speaks out on justice and reform. Months passed. Ethan Clark was dismissed from the police force, his badge revoked, his reputation shattered by his own deceit. Investigations unearthed a pattern of abuse, one Ava's courage had finally exposed. Ava, meanwhile, found herself back on a different kind of battlefield, one built not of war zones, but of words and change. She began speaking publicly, not for fame, but for awareness. Universities, veterans events, community halls, everywhere she went, her story lit a spark. One evening, during a televised interview, the host asked, "Lieutenant Commander Williams, after everything you've endured, the lies, the humiliation, what drives you to keep speaking out?" Ava smiled, calm and thoughtful. Because silence never protects the innocent. It only protects the comfortable. Her words went viral. They became a mantra for those who had once felt voiceless. And in a quiet moment after the cameras turned off, Ava stood backstage, staring at the folded flag she still carried with her, the same one she'd held the night before her testimony. She ran her fingers along its edge and whispered, "Justice isn't something we wait for. It's something we fight for." She turned to leave, her reflection caught briefly in a nearby window, a soldier without a battlefield, yet still standing guard. Because for her, the mission had never been about victory. It had always been about truth. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoyed today's story, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another pulse-pounding cinematic tale from Black Rise. Here's a quick question for you. Would you have forgiven Officer Clark or fought to expose him too? Sometimes forgiveness is the hardest story we ever tell ourselves.